doctor Víctor Almanza, acá está. Y bueno, pues es el doctor Arthur Mizzi, quien tiene mucha experiencia en asimilación de datos y quien ha estado colaborando desde hace varios años con el doctor Agustín García y ahora también con Víctor, y esperamos que con más académicos y estudiantes del instituto. Es un área de mucho interés en el instituto, lo que es la asimilación de datos, la modelación numérica, y además de que él pues, es un experto en este tema. Entonces, pues tenemos mucho gusto en recibirlo. Lo va a dar la semblanza Víctor. Adelante, Víctor.
Gracias, doctor Zavala. Sí, bueno, el doctor Arthur Mizzi es un experto en asimilación de datos, multiespecie y multiplataforma. Él es el principal desarrollador del sistema WRF-Chem que permite asimilar datos de múltiples especies químicas y hacer ajuste dinámico de emisiones. Él actualmente está afiliado al NASA Ames Research Center y a la University of Colorado en Boulder. WRF-Chem es un sistema que incluye todo el estado de la ciencia en asimilación de datos y que se usa en Norteamérica, Asia del Este y Europa Occidental. Entonces, pues sin más preámbulo, un aplauso y gracias, Arthur, por la presentación. Y gracias al instituto por todo el apoyo, ¿no?
Okay. Yo conozco hablar español, pero solamente un poquito. So, no muy bien. Therefore, I'm going to speak in English, and I apologize, but that's the best I can do. So, let's see. Some background. I'm not an atmospheric chemist. I'm an applied mathematician and an atmospheric dynamicist by training. But I got into this field because of the satellite data assimilation, and so if you have some in-depth atmospheric chemistry questions, I probably can't answer them. But if you have questions about chemical data assimilation, satellites, or numerical weather prediction, I'm your man. Okay, we're just going to jump right in. Here's kind of an overview of the talk. I'll skip around, I'll skip sections because I have designed the talk originally for students. And so there's a lot of introductory material that may or may not be necessary. I'm going to blow through that, and I'm not going to encourage as much interaction as I have in my previous seminars. I'll say at the outset, I intend this to be informal. That means if you all have a question, raise your hand and ask. Don't wait for a pause. Don't wait till the end. Let me address it right away. Okay, I want you all to learn about what I'm doing, and if you wait until the end, you'll forget and not be interested. Okay? So please ask questions. I encourage that. So we'll do some quick motivation. We're going to really blow through the numerical weather prediction stuff quickly. Then I'll do a quick introduction to WRF-Chem DART, and then I'll get into the results. Those are really the most interesting. How many of you all are atmospheric air quality people? In other words, air quality forecasters. Raise your hand if you do air quality forecasting. All right. How many of you are familiar with numerical modeling? Raise your hand, please. Okay, more of you. How many are familiar with what's going on in data assimilation? Really, this is really important because everything I do involves data assimilation. So if you don't know what it is, I need to spend time talking about it. So not many of you. Okay. All right. So I'm going to skip over this. All right. The motivation. We all know why studying air quality is important. I'm not going to go into it. These slides are designed for the U.S. This slide shows that even though the economic indicators are going up, air pollution is going down, but then the question is it really solved? This is Denver a few years ago, so it's not. In the U.S., every state has non-attainment areas, which means their air quality is unhealthy for ozone and particulate matter. All right, So an air quality model is nothing more than a numerical weather prediction model. There's two types, global and regional. The work that we're going to talk about focuses on a regional model. My understanding is that that's what you all use for your national forecast system. The reason this is important is because the regional models have lateral boundaries, and so that means you have to provide boundary conditions at the boundaries. Those come from the large-scale models in general. Okay, for the type of work that we do, you have an upper boundary also, because the regional models don't go to the top of the atmosphere, as a global model do. And you also have lower boundary conditions where the emissions come. So air quality, in large part, it's a little bit different than a weather forecast because it's so dependent upon the emissions. And so it's really a Lagrangian advection problem. And early air quality forecasters thought all you needed was the emissions. You don't have to worry about the concentrations. But now everyone is realizing that you need to adjust the concentrations. And as a consequence of that, we're learning how to do top-down emissions adjustment. And I'm going to explain what all this means in a second. And then that raises the question, do we need to do both, adjust concentrations and adjust emissions, or is adjusting the emissions sufficient? Does that all make sense? Because I'm going through this quickly. Okay. This is what the equations look like. There's a local tendency term, a three-dimensional advection term, then the effect of the chemistry on whatever C is. C could be carbon monoxide, ozone, whatever it is, PM, and then there's the emissions term. This is, you solve this numerically, which means and it's an initial boundary value problem, so the more accurate your initial conditions, the more accurate your forecast. Data assimilation does nothing more than try and give you the most accurate, or what we call the optimal initial conditions for this problem. Okay? Questions? Okay. One thing that is important is in the old days, and I think here in Mexico you all still do this, you have a single forecast model and it goes forward in time. That's called a deterministic system. These days we're moving to a probabilistic system. A probabilistic system means you have an ensemble of forecast models and you advance them all forward in time. And this is a good example of what happens. This is at the initial state where they're all slightly different, either due to the model or due to perturbing the initial conditions. But then as they evolve in time, the spread increases. This is just a standard deviation. So spread is another name for the standard deviation of the ensemble. Okay? So that's important because if you've had statistics or probability, you know that the ensemble mean is the most likely indicator of what's going to happen. And so you get a better forecast by using the ensemble forecasting approach than you do by using the deterministic approach, because your deterministic model could be this outlier. That's the problem. So that's why we're moving to ensemble systems. One problem with this is, in the data assimilation context, the spread can collapse because you keep constraining it with observations. I'll explain what all this means in a second. So we have to inflate the spread. That's called inflation. And another problem is, with the ensemble, the atmosphere has infinite number of degrees of freedom, right? You know what I mean by that? Infinite degrees of freedom. You just can't, right? It's got so many things that are varying, we can't account for them all. Okay, and they're all independently varying. When we do an ensemble forecast, the ensemble size is like, you know, if it's a large ensemble, it's 100 ensemble members. That pales by comparison to the degrees of freedom of the atmosphere. So you have a severe undersampling problem in statistical terms. In order to avoid that, we do what's called localization. If the observation is located here, we don't allow the observation to affect a point way out here. okay? Ideally, if the sample size were large enough, the statistics would account for that, and you wouldn't have any adjustments out here. Due to the undersampling problem, we have to enforce that. We have a coefficient that tails off with distance from the observation. And so what you see is there's strong influence near the observation, and then as you move away, it has less influence. That's called localization. Okay? Any questions? So what is data assimilation? I'm not going to go through all this. The idea is it's all based on Bayes' theorem. That's conditional probabilities. And the idea is this is the prior estimate of the atmospheric state based on the prior forecasts and all the information that you have up until this time. Then if you have one more piece of information, in other words, an observation, how can you combine the observation with the prior forecast to give you the optimal first guess at the atmospheric state? Okay, we use this Bayes equation, which is the basis for the common filter. In our case, we use the ensemble common filter. This is the observation probability space. This is the prior, in other words, the most recent forecast probability space. And then we're going to combine these things to get this, the posterior. That's all data assimilation is doing. Okay? This is the probability space for the initial conditions in the model. So now you understand what data assimilation is. Any questions? Yes?
Do you construct the PDFs with ensemble members?
Yes, exactly. So, yes. Any other questions? Here's an example. I don't have the observations up here. These are the ensemble means. So the prior, what was in that prior probability curve, is represented by this ensemble average. This is the ozone forecast for the western U.S. from the WRF-Chem DART systems, just an example. What you see is, based on the posterior, the observations say that the model has over forecast ozone in this area. And so the model has constrained the forecast, reducing the ozone. The difference between the posterior and the prior is called the increment. The increment is how the data assimilation algorithm has adjusted the initial conditions to give you the optimal initial conditions. So here you see that there's a lot of reduction here, a little bit of increase here. This is what you want to see. Yes?
Can you keep that hourly or sub-hourly?
So you can do it hourly. Typically, the major forecast centers now do it 6 hourly. We do it depending on the pollutant that we're interested. We drop it down to 3 hours. We're focusing a lot on NO2, which has a very short lifetime, so we're going to 3 hours. It's called 3-hour cycling. The frequency, so the way this works is you have a forecast that you advance forward, let's say for 6 hours. That gives you the prior. Then you combine it with observations that you don't see here to get the posterior. This is then the initial condition. You issue another 6-hour forecast, which produces a new prior, and you just keep cycling like that. Okay? Yep. Yes?
I wonder what happens when you don't have the observational data at the time you want. I mean, if for some reason you have a window with no observation.
Yes, that's exactly what we do. So I don't have a good example of this, but imagine that I have a timeline here, and my cycling time is right here in the middle of the line. So in practice, if this is 6 o'clock UTC, okay, they don't run the forecast till 7 or 8 o'clock UTC. So they start it retrospectively. They'll take observations if the cycling period is 6 hours, they'll take observations from 3 hours after the cycle time and 3 hours before the cycle time. And then how wide that window is depends on how representative the observations are. With tempo, so I'm getting ahead of myself, but since you asked the question. With tempo, so tempo is a new satellite that's going up that will have it'll be geostationary, it'll have hourly observations at 4 kilometers resolution, which is extraordinary. We're running experiments with proxy data for tempo. And what we're finding is for NO2, at the transition periods, in other words, day to night and night to day, we have to exclude all observations except for the cycle time hour because of representativeness. So that the representative of the observations determines how wide the window is. That's the point. Well, I'm not going to go into this because this is the nuts and bolts of satellite data assimilation, and it'll take up time. And since nobody is really a satellite data assimilator here, it's pointless. This is an example of what's happening so there's an international agreement to put up 3 satellites for air quality observations. This is an example of what's happening. So GEMS was put up last year by South Korea, and so it's focusing on Asia. Tempo is being launched by the United States in the spring of next year, early spring, and then the following year, Sentinel-4 will be launched by the European Space Agency. This will give us global geostationary coverage of the northern hemisphere for air quality. This will be unprecedented. The observations will have, this is South America, this is Southern California, Los Angeles area. These grid boxes are about 4 kilometers on a side. We'll have this type of data every hour. Imagine if you're doing what's called top-down emissions estimation, this will revolutionize our emissions inventories. It'll revolutionize our air quality forecasts. Okay, this, I'm going to quickly go. This illustrates the cycling that I was talking about. So the way this starts, we have to have met conditions to run a meteorology to run a forecast model. We have to have chemistry, initial and boundary conditions, and then we have to have emissions. So at the start of each cycle, we pull all this stuff together. Because it's an ensemble system, we generate the ensemble. For the first cycle, which I call the initial cycle, you have to generate an ensemble of initial conditions and boundary conditions. After that, all you have to do is generate the boundary conditions. On the initial cycle, as it shows here, you skip the update because otherwise you destroy all your spread, and you go right to the forecast step. Then after the forecast step, as it says here, you go back to the next cycle, which starts over here. So this is now the first assimilation cycle. In other words, the first cycle that you apply data assimilation. You go through the same exercise, but for the boundary conditions and emissions only. Then you come down here and you collect the OBS, all this stuff. So the forecast from here comes down to the data assimilation algorithm. The observations come to the data assimilation algorithm. The emissions come to the data assimilation algorithm. And they're all constrained using optimal estimation theory. In other words, the Bayes equation that I put up there earlier to produce the updated initial conditions and boundary conditions, which go into the forecast model, and you just keep doing this, okay? And you can do it, for months. So that's what we do. All right, so WRF-Chem DART is the system that uses, as I mentioned, the ensemble common filter, which comes from DART. That stands for Data Assimilation Research Testbed, and WRF-Chem, which I think most of you are familiar with, So I developed WRF-Chem DART. I started developing it about 10 years ago. Now it assimilates MOPID, IAZI, OMI, MODIS, TROP-OMI, TEMPO. We're working on TESS, CRIS. It's basically, it's not quite on par with the European Center system yet, but it's getting close in terms of the number of satellite observations that it can assimilate. The difference is that it's regional versus global. Okay, so now we're going to change. Do you have any questions? Because we're going to change gears a little bit. These are my results, okay? And these are results from the work that I do with various collaborators, and they have varying significance. So one thing that you might think is important is how far in advance can we do an air quality forecast? You know, if you knew that the air quality was going to be bad a week from today, you might be able to do something to avoid it, right? It's called mitigating a bad air quality event. And that's pretty important. In the US, a lot of the regulations are designed to encourage mitigation, in other words, avoidance. All right, so typically, air quality so the longer you can predict an air quality event with skill is called predictability. Typically, air quality has a predictability time scale of 24 hours. It doesn't extend much. And so what happens is the models will after 24 hours, they return to a result which is the same as no data assimilation, no chemical data assimilation. So what this group in China did is they did emissions adjustment as well as concentration adjustment using surface observations. And they were able to extend the predictability timescale for all the criteria pollutants, CO, ozone, PM, NO2, and SO2 from 24 hours out to 48 to 96 hours. So this is a very important result because it enables you to warn once the community has confidence that your air quality forecasts are accurate, it enables you to warn the community of upcoming poor air quality events. Sure, questions?
Do you measure against the climatology or how you?
So there's two ways of measuring increase in skill. One, in the meteorological world, it's traditionally measured against persistence. You say the forecast tomorrow is the same as the weather today. What we do is compare it to the no chemical data assimilation case. Because that was, as I mentioned earlier, that was the standard. EPA used to believe, the US EPA, used to believe that if you had the correct emissions, you didn't need to do chemical data assimilation. And so a lot of the work a lot of the thrust of the work that we've been doing had been to convince EPA and NOAA that you have to do chemical data assimilation. Both EPA and NOAA have come around, and they are now, both of them are independently working on data assimilation schemes for their air quality forecast systems. Okay, this is a little different project. This was at UC Berkeley in California, and the graduate student was using what we call proxy tempo data, and what she was trying to do is figure out if you assimilate air quality data, can you improve the meteorology forecast? And that's, historically, that has been what we call the holy grail of chemical data assimilation because the meteorological community hasn't wanted to waste time on assimilating atmospheric chemistry observations. But if it improves their meteorological forecast, then they're more convinced that they need to do it. And so the circles highlight areas where they have significant improvements in the east-west wind speed as a consequence assimilating atmospheric chemistry data. I'm going to skip that. This one is a wildfire. So a big problem in the U.S. is transport of the emissions from wildfires. And what happens is they're rich in VOCs, and so they react with the NO2 to produce ozone, and then the ozone contributes to the exceedance of the ozone criteria. And so there's a lot of work now in the U.S., and I hear that this is also true in Mexico, to understand and better characterize wildfire emissions and wildfire transport. And so this was done by some colleagues at the University of Houston, and he's assimilating formaldehyde as a proxy for the VOCs, because formaldehyde's the end product of oxidation of the VOCs. He's assimilating NO2, because the NO2 reacts with the VOCs to produce ozone. And then he's assimilating MOIS AODs, that's aerosol optical depth, and it's a total column measurement, and that's a proxy for the aerosols, the smoke plume, if you will. Okay? And so by assimilating all those, he's trying to improve his forecast of ozone and smoke. And he's doing this for a field program called FIRE-XAQ that went on in the US in 2019. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but the red curve is no data assimilation. The black curve is the observations. And he has 2 data assimilation experiments. And what you see is both of them have significant improvements in the forecast of ozone. So this is a big result.
On the minimum, not on the maximum.
It's also true in the maximum, but not as much. That's true. In terms of the smoke, the top is the observation and the bottom is the model with no data assimilation. You can see how bad it is in cases. So the difference between the 2 DA experiments is one assimilates the AOD, which is the smoke observation, and the other doesn't. And so what I think is the important result, this one doesn't assimilate the smoke observations. By just assimilating the NO2 and formaldehyde, the cross correlations have improved the aerosol production in the model. That's a very important result because you don't need smoke observations to improve the smoke forecast. Okay. All right, so all right, so those are all various research topics that I've worked on with various collaborators around the U.S. So my personal research, has focused on 2 things. One, what's called joint chemical data assimilation. So historically, if you have 3 satellite platforms, let's call them OMI, TROPOMI, and TEMPO, and they're all observing NO2, most scientists and operational centers, this isn't true for the European Center, but otherwise it is true, they won't assimilate all 3 because they conflict with each other and they cause problems in they're worried that they cause problems in the chemistry, etc. So by not assimilating all 3, by assimilating only 1, we call that independent data assimilation. If they were to assimilate all 3, we call it joint data assimilation. And so we're studying not only joint by different platforms, but joint, for example, assimilating both NO2 and ozone. And you have great potential for conflict because if the ozone doesn't match if the NO2 doesn't match the ozone observations, then you get a conflict in the model and you get unrealistic results. All right. So my initial, and so there's another sort of piece of information you need to know about ozone observations. The satellite observations, it's a satellite looking down from the, on the globe from above the atmosphere. And since there's a high level of ozone up near the tropopause, it measures ozone from basically the top of the atmosphere to the surface. These regional models have a top that's well below, it's at the tropopause or slightly below. So it's well below the top of the column that the satellite sees. So conventionally or traditionally, ozone, satellite observed ozone was not assimilated in regional models. And so in addition to this joint assimilation stuff, one of the things that I've been working on is coming up with a strategy to assimilate ozone in regional models. And I've tried a bunch of different things which haven't worked. And I'm trying something that seems obvious, and it didn't work at first, but now it seems to be working, and so I'm not really sure what I did differently. But what I do is I take the large-scale model profile and use it as an upper boundary condition for on the regional model, so that when I go to apply the satellite averaging kernel, which extends to the top of the atmosphere, I can complete the summation for the model's estimate of the observation. And that first result that I showed you is an example of the type of result of the type of ozone that I'm getting. Yes?
Normally, at what level do you put your top in the regional model?
Yes, it varies between 50 kilometers and 200. Most people don't use 200. 100 hectopascals is pretty typical. Rarely does it go above 50. I mean, I suppose there are some that go to 10, but that's pretty unusual. But just to close this out, Omi goes up to a fraction of a hectopascal. Tropomi the same way. Tempo, I'm not sure, but it's close. So anyway, that's the problem. So this first set of joint assimilation experiments doesn't have the ozone in it, and then the second set does. So, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. What these show are the observations on the left. One is NO2, or this is focusing on NO2. So the top panel on your left is a satellite observation. This is the satellite swath. These are what we call geostationary. They're polar orbiters or low Earth orbiting satellites, as opposed to a geostationary satellite, which would see the entire western U.S. And then the lower panel is surface observations, and then this shows you the increment from assimilating those, and this shows you the difference between a no data assimilation experiment and a data assimilation experiment. And these are typical of what you might see, which is why I put them in here. Here's the sort of the take-home point. Before, historically, a lot of the top-down emissions adjustment research has been done using global models and aggregating emissions into geographical sectors. Okay, and the thinking has been is that you have to average the top-down effect over a period of time to get realistic corrections to the emissions. So we have started experimenting with what we call dynamic emissions adjustment, where we adjust the emissions at every grid point, every cycle time. Okay? And what we found is, so that I showed you the earlier result from China where he was using surface obs. We're now using satellite obs to do this. And this, I'm not going to go over the CO result, but the magnitude of the improvement isn't as great, but we get similar improvements over there. What you see is without the emissions adjustment, we can't get the ozone profile to kick out at the NO2 profile to kick out near the surface like the observation does. This problem, various groups have been working on this problem for years. It wasn't until we started doing the emissions adjustment that we were able to get it to kick out like this. And so this result now has spawned a lot of research, well, in the groups that I work with, a lot of research on the benefits of what we call dynamical emissions adjustment. And I'm going to give a little background. I should have done this earlier, but how we do the emissions adjustment. So the ensemble common filter, in effect, calculates correlations between the observations and the ensemble members. So if you have an observation of NO2, and you'll have a single observation of NO2, right? But because we have an ensemble of models, let's say we have 10-member ensemble. We have 10 different model estimates for what the observation should be, right? If you take the difference between the observation and the model estimate of the observation, that's in effect the correction that the models need to see, each model needs to see. That's called the innovation. In the ensemble common filter, what's called the gain multiplies the innovation to determine the increment. In other words, how much you update the prior. The gain is based on the correlation between those innovations and the ensemble of target variables. So we have an ensemble of innovations up here, say for NO2, and we have an ensemble of ozone values down here. There's a correlation between them, and that's how you figure out what the update to the ozone is. All right, ozone and NO2 are both prognostic variables in air quality models. In other words, the model time steps them forward. Emissions aren't. Right now, we specify the emissions at each cycle. So there's this idea where if you generate an ensemble for the emissions and add them to the state vector, in other words, the vector that gets updated, the collection of variables that gets updated during the optimization step, you can do the emissions adjustment. So what we do is we add the emissions. So now we have an ensemble of emissions, and we have an ensemble of innovations, and we have correlations between the emissions and the innovations. That's how you update the emissions. And at first, those correlations are weak because it's an artificially generated ensemble. But as you cycle, you get more, the emissions reflect the corrections, and you tend to get real correlations, if you will. And so that's how we're updating the emissions. And it's turning out, this result is just sort of the beginning. It's turning out to be a very successful activity. So this is showing, I'm going to really blow through these quickly, but this is the reason I put this up there. This is showing the effect of this ozone assimilation algorithm. I'm getting reasonable results. So the all-chem experiment means I'm assimilating all observations, and in this case, all chemistry observations. In this case, it means CO, O2, SO2, NO2, and ozone, and PM. Okay, so everything is being assimilated. This one has no emissions adjustment. This does have emissions adjustment. And don't strain your eyes, there's no difference. Turns out there was a bug, which I found. I knew that there wasn't any difference. I thought it was because it's so close to the beginning of the experiment, I hadn't had a chance for the emissions adjustment to spin up. As it turns out, there was a bug, which I found while I was here. So don't worry about that. The important message is that we can assimilate ozone and we're getting realistic results. This is the difference This is the control result. This is the difference from the control, and this is the increment from the two experiments. So the take-home message is this seems to be working. This ozone assimilation in regional models seems to be working. I'm running it for a field program in the US where I'll be able to verify it. And hopefully, well, within a few months, I'll have the answer and publish the paper. So I'm going to skip the rest of the results here in the interest of time. This is an experiment that I think this is a very important experiment. And NOAA, so in the US, I work with NASA, and I sit at the University of Colorado. So we have a joint collaboration on this particular project between NOAA, NASA, and the University of Colorado. And the idea is we're interested in whether or not with dynamic emissions adjustment, we can recover COVID period emissions during an OSSI, in a bench scale experiment. And I'll explain, how many of you know what an observing system simulation experiment is? Anybody? Okay, all right, it's a little complicated, but stick with me on this. All right, we take a model, we set it up so that it's as close, it's our best model that we have, and in this case, we use the NOAA's estimate of the emissions during COVID. And these estimates are top-down. They're based on all the economic indicators, the way they normally prepare the bottom-up inventory. And it's been vetted by various scientists around the country in the U.S. So it's generally believed that these are accurate assessment of the COVID period emissions for the continental U.S. All right. So we run this model for 2 months during COVID. We now assume that model is the real atmosphere. So that we refer to that as the nature run. So we can then go and use the satellites. We know how the satellites do their observations. So we can take tempo observations from the nature run. And we can take tropomi observations from the nature run. Now, those are perfect observations because the satellite is perfectly observing the atmosphere. So you then have to impose a bunch of realistic errors on it. You know the error distribution for the satellite observations, so you can impose that on the perfect observations to get actual observations. Does that make sense? Any questions on how we generate the nature run and how we generate our observations? Okay. All right, so then you run what's called the experimental runs. In the experimental runs, we use different models. So they're similar, but they're different. So we don't have this problem of the model climatology forcing us to the nature run, okay? And we use business as usual emissions. And the business as usual emissions are significantly different than the COVID emissions. I mean, I don't have a way of demonstrating that, but that's been studied, that's been looked at. And then you run it and you assimilate the different observations. And the point of the experiment is to see if we can recover the COVID emissions by assimilating the satellite observations. Does that make sense? So we run 2 experiments, one where we assimilate tempo, and the other where we assimilate tropomi. The reason for the difference is tempo has observations every hour covering the entire North America, okay? Tropomi has coverage over most of the continental U.S., in fact, all of the continental U.S., but it visits once a day, or once every 3/4 of a day. So the spatial resolution is similar, the temporal resolution is different. And so the point of the OSSI is to see, 1, can we recover the emissions from tempo and tropomi? And 2, is there a difference in using tempo versus tropomi? And this matters because NOAA, our our operational forecast agency wants to know, because they're going to invest a lot of money in their own version of TEMPO, an operational satellite for weather forecasting. It's called GeoExoProd satellite. Okay, so does that all make sense? Because I'm going to explain these results, and I think these results are very important, and so does NOAA. I mean, this is part of the basis for their new NOAA's new satellite. It'll go up 5 to 10 years. And what's in this red circle, it's kind of hard to see, but the blue curve is the, oh yeah, you can see the true emissions. Okay, the blue curve is the COVID emissions. The black curve is the business as usual emissions. The red curve is the TEMPO result, and the green curve is the TROPOMI result. And so what you see is both TEMPO and TROPOMI start out close to the black curve, as they should, but then, and then we're going to ignore the dashed curves for right now. Then TEMPO very quickly approaches the green curve and stays there. I mean, it varies a little bit, but pretty much stays there. TROPOMI takes a little bit longer, but then it does the same thing. So the answer to the first question, can we recover the emissions? Yes. And if you look at out here, we're recovering them within 5 to 10%. So we're doing very well. So this is saying that this top-down emissions estimation method, where that everyone has been wondering just how accurate is it, this is telling us that it's pretty darn accurate. Okay. The other point is there is benefit to TEMPO. It doesn't seem like a lot here. It's a 24-hour difference, right? But emissions vary. And the accuracy of your forecast depends on the ability to capture the variations in emissions. TEMPO does a much better job at capturing those temporal variability than TROPOMI does. And we're running sensitivity experiments now to see just how sensitive TEMPO is to these variations. So this is a graduate student project. He's going to get his PhD. It's a guy from Taiwan who's working on this, and he's going to get his PhD based on this. And this is just another way of looking at it. I'm not going to, so these maps show you that TEMPO tends, if you look at it geographically instead of in a bulk statistics sort of way, you get similar results, that TEMPO does better than TROPOMI, especially in urban areas. It's not so true. They tend to do the same in unpolluted areas, but in urban areas or highly polluted areas, TEMPO does better than TROPOMI. Then this shows you the difference. So this is what we call a line histogram. This is no pollution, and this is a high pollution. They're percentiles of pollution. And then this is the relative error. And so this is showing you the results with no data assimilation, with TEMPO, and with TROPOMI at the start. And this is showing you the results at the end. And the thing that has been bothering us here is this low bias. We're trying to figure out why there's a low bias. This will be two, whoops, I'm going to skip these. These are individual. Those are two different metrics for urban areas. One is RMSE, and the other one is normalized mean bias. And at most places, you find that TEMPO outperforms TROPOMI, but at some places, you find that it doesn't. And we're not sure why yet. That's part of we're researching, or what he's researching. But one thing we're interested in is why we're getting this low bias. I have an idea, and it's a little difficult to test it, but we're in the process of testing it. The common filter assumes that you have a Gaussian distribution. Let's see, trace gases and emissions are distributed log normally. And so what the point of this is if you sample, assuming you have a Gaussian distribution, but you actually have a log normal distribution, you tend to sample at the low end of the log normal distribution. And so that then biases your result on the low side. So I think that's what's going on. And so we're instituting a transform, a log transform for everything before we do the data assimilation. It's not as simple as just taking the log of the concentrations and then doing the assimilation. You have to generate the ensemble after taking the log, and you have to do the inflation after taking the log. And so it's a little more complicated than just taking the log. But this is one of the things he's going to work on, probably not for his thesis, though. Okay. We're going to go over. So I'll just summarize what's going on here. I'm not going to go over this in detail. Those were all done at 12 kilometers resolution. We know that when you go into chemical data assimilation, as you increase the resolution, you get more problems. And so this is a 4-kilometer study that I was doing to see just how well things work. And the other point of this was to assimilate tempo data and see how that worked. And the message is that things are working. We get realistic results. The only problem was that we found that tropomi had a bias, and so I had to institute a bias correction. And after instituting the bias correction, we get mixed results. When you compare the tropomi assimilation against Moppet, you get an improvement, but when you compare it against surface data, you don't, which isn't surprising because the total column is not as sensitive to the surface as maybe it should be. Okay. I'm not going to talk about this, but some of you may have heard this idea of compact phase-based retrievals. This is why I started chemical data assimilation. I was hired to come up, so the averaging kernel is rank efficient, and I was hired to come up with and my background's applied math, and so I was hired to come up with a way of trying to account for this rank deficiency. And so I spent time on this. All right, so I'll close. I'm not going to go over my future work in detail. It's obvious I'm interested in the bias correction and the ozone assimilation. We have a proposal out to do a regional chemical reanalysis. It'll be 20 years for the CONUS. If it gets funded, that's a huge deal because it enables you to look at the effect of climate change and things like that at a local scale, on the regional scale. And then the other thing that we have a proposal for is, so lightning produces NOx, which gets mixed downward, and then that helps to contribute to the ozone problem. We have a proposal to do data assimilation for lightning NOx, actually. And then the other thing is we're trying to see whether the GOES AOD can adjust the wildfire emissions in this proposal. And then lastly, it's another wildfire project, but here at the University of Iowa, they're developing a height-dependent AOD observation, in other words, height-dependent aerosols. And then if you use a stereo GOES observations, you can also get height-dependent aerosols. We're looking to see whether or not those can improve, the assimilation of those observations can improve the wildfire injection heights, because we know that one of the main reasons we can't do the smoke transport is because of highly inaccurate injection heights. And then I'll close with research problems for graduate students. So ozone retrieval and regional model, I might not have the best solution. And so there's looking for a good solution for that is a good graduate student problem. Wildfire emissions estimation, everywhere. If some student or somebody can come up with a solution for that, that'll be a big deal. Personally, I'm interested in the compact phase-space retrievals because I spent a lot of time on it. Because it's in phase space as opposed to physical space, whether you can do joint assimilation or emissions adjustments, a big question. How sensitive, this is that question that I was suggesting, how sensitive are the dynamic emissions estimates to changes in the emissions? You know, they could be spikes, like if you have an oil and gas field and they spring a leak, they get a really high spike. You'd like to be able to detect that remotely. Another, it could be like if you have a cold event, and so everybody turns on their air conditioner or their heaters, and so now the power plant generation goes way up. And here's other problems which I'll leave for you all to read. And I'll take any questions that you may not have already asked. Thank you.
¿Preguntas?
That's okay. Speak in Spanish and he'll translate.
Okay. Sí, mi pregunta es sobre qué piensas que es, digamos, la mejor traza para poder hacer que los pronósticos sean mejores, los pronósticos de viento, digamos, la parte dinámica. O sea, ¿qué debo hacer, qué debo medir en la parte química para que la parte del pronóstico numérico sea mejor?
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question. So, okay. What chemical variables should you include to have a better meteorological forecast?
Oh, wow, that is
wind.
That's a very good question, and I don't know the answer. I don't know that anybody does. I think what you'd want is something that's long-lived as opposed to short-lived. So NO2 probably isn't the way to go. But CO would be a good way. I can't remember what the ozone lifetime is. I think it's fairly long, relatively long. But that would be my guess, is you want a long-lived species, something with a long half-life.
Well, I wonder if when you do the data assimilation, you do it separately for each variable, or you make a budget. Like ozone depends on other variables to form. But if you assimilate ozone indirectly, you're modifying the whole system, the whole budget, for example.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to rephrase the question. There are two ways in which you can update the model state variables. One way is if you have an ozone observation, for example, you can directly update the ozone state variable. And I think this is what you're asking. So that relies on direct correlations. That relies on the variance terms in the ensemble error covariance matrix, okay? Another way you can do it is NO2 and ozone are related, and we know that they're related because of the chemistry. And so in the ensemble error covariance matrix, there's a correlation, a cross correlation between an NO2 observation and an ozone state variable. And so you can either turn that on or turn that off through it's a state variable localization matrix. You can broaden this. So those are two that everybody would agree are related. We know that statistically CO and ozone are correlated. So you could also use CO observations to update an ozone. Okay, and similarly, we can use ozone observations to update NO2. And so you're right, it can upset the chemistry, and that's why traditionally chemical data assimilation groups have stayed away from using the cross correlations. I didn't go into this here, but that's one of the things that more recent studies have started exploring. So we do that. There's a scientist from Japan. His name is Yuko Miyazaki. He's now in the US at JPL, so in Los Angeles. But he's done a lot of work in exploring the benefit of cross correlations. And in his lightning Knox adjustment, he exploits the cross correlations. In our wildfire work, the one that I showed you from the University of Houston, he's exploiting the cross correlations. In all of our wildfire emissions adjustments, some are direct, but most of it is going to rely on cross correlations. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Partially, yes.
Yes. Okay. What part didn't I answer?
I mean, if there's no constraints to have a budget as a whole system.
That's correct. There is no, just the model. That's correct. There's no.
There are other models that I know in biogeochemical that they have a budget. Say, for example, nitrogen for ocean, and it has relation with plankton, then with zooplankton, but the whole is a budget.
Right.
So if you modify one, you're modifying the whole budget.
Right.
Nitrogen. But somehow can be improved, implemented, I guess.
Right. So I don't know of anyone that constrains the budget. Now, I suppose, you know, it'd be like having a, anyway, I could think it would be a constrained optimization problem. And you could, outside of the data assimilation context, we do have, you know, mathematically, we have those types of problems. So I don't see any reason why we couldn't do that.
Nice presentation,
Well, thank you.
Arthur. Can you
Muchas
help me with
gracias.
the slide 55?
Which one?
The other 55. The another slide, please.
This one. Yeah.
You talk about the methodology for emission estimation, about the methods top-down.
Yeah.
What is your opinion about the bottom-up methods?
So you have to have bottom-up methods.
Yeah.
Because if for no other, I'm going to speak from a U.S. point of view, all right? You have to have them if for no other reason because it forces industry to give their emissions to EPA so that EPA can review them and say, oh, they're too high, or these aren't correct and we need to enforce, okay? But practically, the emissions, the bottom-up inventory has too much uncertainty. And the other problem is it's too localized. You have a good quantification of the emissions around urban areas and areas where you have people and industry. But then as soon as you go off into the rural areas, one, there aren't a lot of people and there's not a lot of regulators and the estimates sort of go to pot. And so you really need an objective way of seeing, of estimating the emissions in both rural and urban areas. And I think the only way you're going to be able to do that is with satellites. And so it doesn't replace bottom up, but I think that in the long run, all of our emissions inventories are going to be first guess based on bottom up and final result based on top down.
Okay, thank you.
That's my thinking, my personal thinking. Maybe Augustine doesn't agree.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Thank you. Thanks, Arthur. I have a question. What happens with the residual ozone? I mean, it is not always measured by surface monitors. Probably Tempo can observe it very early in the morning, but tropomi doesn't because it passes at noon. Is there any way to estimate the concentration?
So I'm not familiar with the term residual ozone. Can you explain more about what that is?
Yeah, there is a concentration of ozone very early in the morning that probably remains from the day before.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so now what's your question regarding residual ozone?
It is some part, but I don't know if one of the ensembles estimate that concentration or what is the starting point of ozone. I mean, it's not just the emission or it is.
No, okay, so I understand. It's okay. So first, Tempo could observe that. It's not likely that you could get it with a LEO-type satellite. But it's not as, I mean, you have to have a way, it's sort of like smoke AOD. You have to have a way of identifying the residual, of distinguishing the residual from whatever else is going on. And so you could use a model for doing that. And so it's possible that we could figure out what the residual ozone is in that way. But directly observing it, I don't think, just sitting here, I can't think of a way to do that. Right, does that make sense? You could diagnose it. That's what they do with smoke AOD. They measure the background AOD during a fire. So they have a measure of the background AOD during a fire event, and then they look at the AOD that's measured by the satellite. They effectively subtract off the background, and that gives them what they call the smoke AOD.
Are there any plans for sorry. Are there any plans for covering the southern part of, I mean, the global south and the local south, perhaps? Because, I mean, your Tropomi and your other satellite only cover the U.S., basically,
right.
and a little bit of Mexico, yes, but...
Well, actually, Tropomi should cover Mexico because it's a polar orbiter, so it will do swaths. If this is Mexico, it'll do swaths like this across Mexico. Tempo is on, so this has received a lot of discussion during my visit. Tempo is on the southern edge of what's called the field of regard for Tempo. In other words, Tempo sits here and scans like this, so it's scanning, and down here, Mexico is included within its scanning window. But it's on the edge, so it's high angle, and there's some question as to just how accurate those observations will be. So there's a lot of interest in, so I work closely with the people that are preparing synthetic tempo data, and they have a lot of interest in the work that I'm doing with groups down here for just that reason. So the answer is yes, there's observations, and there will be observations from tempo. We just don't know how useful they'll be yet. And this group, actually, I should speak for Michel, his system will be used as ground truth for tempo.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Okay.
If not,
Well, thank you very much for your attention and all your questions. I appreciate it.
thank you very much, Arthur, for your presentation, your visit. And,
De nada.
yeah, thank you.